and welcome to Tampa Bay Community Network. I'm Susana Weymouth, the Executive Director of Tampa Bay Businesses for Culture and the Arts. Today we're going to be talking about the nexus between business and analytics and creativity and the arts, and the benefits that each can bring to the other. To begin, I'd like to welcome Dr. Merle Archie, who's the Director of the Doctor of Business Administration program at the University of South Florida's MUMA College of Business. Dr. Merle Archie, welcome. You're also an instructor in Information Sciences.
Information Systems and Decision Sciences.
Information Systems and Decision Sciences. And I understand that you have a very unique background. You are a graduate of West Point and served in the Army. Thank you for your service.
Well, thank you, Susana. Thank you for the opportunity to be here with you today. We're very excited about the program.
Tell us a little bit about your educational background, Matt, and some of the things that led up to you taking over as director of the DBA program.
So after West Point, I was privileged to spend the 80s in the Army as an infantry officer. I spent all of my time as a light infantry airborne ranger, mostly in the Pacific Rim. After that, I spent the next 25 years of my life in industry, automotive, med devices, and applied materials, with roles as from everything from industrial engineer to chief operating officer, CEO, president. Spun off a few companies and started a few companies of my own. And then in 2012, really, I was able to come back to Largo, Clearwater, Florida, where I grew up. And because we could, we found a property on St. Pete Beach, which we love. And I was introduced to the faculty in my department at the University of South Florida. I fell in love with the program, with the students, with the members of faculty, and actually pursued my PhD at USF. Just about the time I completed my PhD in 2014, our dean, Moaz Lamayam, and one of my colleagues, Dr. Grandin Gill, had a brainstorm, had an idea about the opportunity to present a professional DBA, Doctor of Business Administration program. Actually, it would have been ideal for me had it existed when I pursued my PhD. And that's the program I direct at the MUMA College of Business today.
And I understand that this is a program that's not that old. It's what, 3-4 years old?
That's correct. We are recruiting now for our 5th cohort. We start every cohort every January, and we will be graduating our 2nd cohort here this December.
So you have something that differentiates the DBA program from other programs that are somewhat similar. Can you talk a little bit about your case studies? When do you start those? How does that work?
One of the things we determined from the very beginning in the definition of the program was that we wanted our students to apply the research immediately. So very quickly in the very first semester, they have an opportunity to go through a case writing program. I actually co-teach that program. And we fundamentally get them to look at tough decisions, wicked decisions that they're facing in their business, conduct research around that, and write that up. We've been very fortunate in the now 4 years that we have conducted that course. Our students have gone on to national honors for the cases that they've written, and these are historically in environments that were promoting academic literature. So it just tells you that these cases are fungible, tangible, they're meaningful, they tackle tough decisions, and our seasoned working professionals have demonstrated an ability to write world-class cases in the very first semester of our program.
And they're often published. And you yourself have published a very interesting article about creativity and that analytical process. And since we're here today talking about that nexus, can you address a little bit, say, with your paper and with some of the goals of these case studies, that crossover, that cross-fertilization in those fields?
Not just with case study, but with most interesting research today in the business environment. The toughest thing to do is frequently to ask critically interesting questions. You know, we have a quote that says, in the day of Google, where Google can answer any question, the toughest thing is really asking interesting questions. And so the creative component associated with designing new processes and systems with designing the future, a better future for our businesses, is tied up in, yes, we have to be analytical, we have to get to the facts, we have to be empirically motivated, but we often find that one of the most challenging things is that creative component, which really speaks to the kinds of relationships that as a college we're looking to build in this community. I personally spend quite a bit of time in the incubator community, in the entrepreneurial community. I work with the WAVE, with FIBA, Florida Israel Business Accelerator, with USF Connect, with the USF NSF I-Corps programs, all designed to take these opportunities for creative, innovative ideas and see if we can't produce innovative companies, often in the technology space.
But there we're going to address this entrepreneurial, often tech forefront that you're on, because you're on those boards and mentoring and instructing in some cases. So there's that other side of what they're looking for, and that is the creative workforce, the creative skills, the experimentation, that process of discovery. And you were speaking about mining the campus and crossing over to other colleagues that you have at very high levels at USF. And USF is very fortunate to have a number of just excellent programs. Can you talk a little bit about your very exciting relationship that you're building with USF Graphic Studio?
You know, in the College of Business, we really know that there aren't any real interesting problems that aren't multidisciplinary and cross-disciplinary. One of the relationships that I've been just so thrilled to build is with Margaret Miller, who runs Graphic Studio and a number of other innovative programs on campus. And Margaret and her team have this wonderful track record of bringing onto campus, sometimes quietly, sometimes with a big splash, very innovative artists. And when we look at the challenges that the MUMA College of Business has put foremost into our mission statement, our Dean Moaz Lamayam has said that we will be among, in addition to everything else we do, focused on analytics and creativity. We are now at the point where I can confidently say that across the college, all of our departments have an analytics component built into all of our programs. And we are at the cusp of building that creative component into every one of our programs. And so as a college, this year in particular, we were absolutely thrilled when the Tampa Bay Business Community and the Arts Board were looking for nominees for their Impact Award to nominate Graphic Studio and Margaret Miller and her team as leaders in the forefront of the creative arts. And as I look at our opportunities going forward, Margaret and I and Moaz and the rest of the faculty have wonderful opportunities to partner.
And part of these opportunities is looking at the processes that the resident artists and visiting artists from around the world, who are some of the most compelling artists of our time, are coming to collaborate with Graphic Studio, which, by the way, is celebrating its 50th anniversary this year. So for 5 decades, this has been a magnet, a hotbed of creativity. But the processes, this experimentation, different perspectives that the visiting artist or resident artist brings in, and then the master printmakers, what kind of a I think I've heard you use the word a collision course that kind of happens, that when they all come together and don't quite know what the end result is, so there's a lot of experimentation. But how do you apply that, say, back to your business ventures?
My experience with Graphic Studios and some of the artists and all of the art work that's produced there is that it is this wonderful collision of creativity, but also discipline and drive and multidisciplinary behaviors on the part of the artists and the technicians. It's a real interesting collision associated with technology too. Every one of these creative artists are doing mixed medias. They're involving more and more technology and digital arts and digital opportunities. And what I find in the area of research and the paper that you refer to really focuses on is this idea that when we think about creativity, it doesn't happen by accident, really. It happens by this guided emergent search process. And the artists that Margaret and her team work with on a daily basis, designing and defining a better future. I'm convinced that businesses who are invested in change can learn from the processes, and we can use those creative approaches in a designed way to help us improve our systems, our businesses, everything from the way we get things done to the things that we provide to our customers.
How wonderful. Well, that leads us very directly into, we have a terrific video that was produced for TBCN Impact Awards, celebrating, recognizing, and acknowledging Graphic Studio and its important role in our community and really in the world. And so we'd like to now introduce the video. Thank you so much, Matt, for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thank you, Susana.
The investigative and exploratory press and publisher, USF Graphic Studio, has played an important and pioneering role in American printmaking for over 50 years. Margaret Miller serves as the 5th director of Graphic Studio, while also leading the USF Contemporary Art Museum and Public Art Program as the director of the Institute for Research and Art.
Graphic Studio was founded in 1968 by Donald J. Saff, who was then Dean of the College of the Arts. He'd come from New York, and he liked the idea of bringing leading artists from all over the world, really, to Tampa to make art. So he established this experiment in art and education that has continued for over 50 years. Don Saff was very connected with leading artists across the country and was able to bring to Tampa artists like Robert Rauschenberg and James Rosenquist. And their experiments here pushed the boundaries as we understood them at the time of printmaking. They did things like work on a very large scale or combine three-dimensional elements with two-dimensional elements. So the experimentation and conversations between the artists and the printmakers often lead to new techniques and ideas.
The shop was conceived in part, at the university because the technical possibilities were so great. You had physicists, engineers, chemists. You could rely on so many different areas of expertise to fund into the creating of a work of art.
There's a tremendous advantage to having a press, a not-for-profit press, free from commercial constraints to some degree, and invite artists to come in and mine the campus for concepts and ideas. So over the years, there have been innovations. So what we found of going across campus is everybody's excited to work with us, and we can get them engaged in the process and apply all sorts of technologies to the making of art. And the other aspect I think, that sets us and distinguishes us is that we are really bringing artists that aren't really familiar with printmaking techniques. They come from working as painters or sculptors in another medium, and they're introduced to printmaking, and this extends their practice. It allows them to experiment with new ways to make marks and new techniques that just are not part of their visual vocabulary. Graphic Studio would not be distinguished without having leading printmakers and artisans as part of its staff. And in some cases, it is the artisan, the printmaker, that artists are attracted to work with. Alex Katz, who's a very famous artist that we've worked with happily for several years now, would not be working with us if it wasn't for our master printer, Tom Pruitt.
My name is Tom Pruitt. I'm the studio manager of Graphic Studio, and I've been at this in this position about 20 years. This particular print is a 14-run lithograph, woodcut, and screen print by the artist Alex Katz.
When an artist arrives, these magical relationships develop between artist and artisan. For example, one of the most famous artists that we've worked with in the last 10 years is Christian Markley. Sarah Howard was really the link with him and getting him to investigate all of these different materials.
I'm Sarah Howard. I'm curator of public art and social practice and research associate. Graphic Studio also provides public access to a professional working studio in a collaborative model and working with some of the most distinguished and compelling artists of our time.
In 1990, an archive of Graphic Studio was established at the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. So to this day, we continue to offer one of everything we produce to the National Gallery. One of everything we produce comes into the University of South Florida collection. Over 50 years, that's 1,400 prints, valued at now $7.7 million. Major museums like the Guggenheim, the Whitney, the Museum of Modern Art, museums in Europe and in Brazil, and acquire the works that are produced here. And then, of course, Kristen Soderquist, our sales and marketing expert director, goes on the road, so to speak, but we participate in art fairs.
My name is Kristen Soderquist. I'm the Director of Sales and Marketing here at Graphic Studio. And I think what's so amazing about Graphic Studio is the fact that nobody does what we do.
So this is a way of getting the work distributed. And this is very important to the artists, that once they produce something, we help put it into the market. Graphic Studio is recognized internationally, and that allows us to bring artists of emerging and recognized talent to Graphic Studio.
Since its founding, Graphic Studio has invited over 100 emerging and established contemporary artists from around the world who have produced more than 1,000 limited edition print and sculpture multiples.
Some members of our community have really built significant collections. That provokes a dialogue with the collector, and often this is just the stimulus, and they go on to really understand about collecting and end up buying things that are not part of the Graphic Studio productions, but other works. And this has been a catalyst for the building of some very major collections in this area. When you're working with very, very leading artists and they're just on the edge of making contributions, they're often working to give visibility to ideas that might be very challenging and require people to shift their perspective and their understanding of certain issues. And so we really look forward to bringing artists of that caliber to the studio to make work.
For over 50 remarkable years, USF Graphic Studio has boldly built on Don Saff's unprecedented idea of harnessing master printmakers and university-wide expertise as a creative magnet, drawing some of the world's most important artists to a joint ambitious scope of research with often revolutionary inventions of materials, techniques, and processes, and yielding renowned prints and series. Today, USF Graphic Studio is recognized and celebrated as an exemplar of collaboration, innovation, and education with far-reaching and profound global impact. I'm pleased to have with us today Margaret Miller, who is the Director for the Institute for Research and Art, Contemporary Art Museum, USF Graphic Studio, all at the University of South Florida College of the Arts. Welcome, Margaret.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Susana.
You are the 5th director now in Graphic Studio long and storied history, over 5 decades. In fact, happy anniversary, because this year Graphic Studio is celebrating your 50th anniversary. And you've had a very, very long history of attracting some of the most compelling and important artists of our time throughout the course of Graphic Studio. Can you tell us a little bit about how Graphic Studio works with these artists, some of the past artists? We've just watched this very interesting video that talked about Bob Rauschenberg, James Rosenquist, some of the earlier artists, Robert Mapplethorpe. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the artists that you're currently working with and some of the ones that are coming up, and what's happening that's new and exciting at Graphic Studio?
Well, that was one giant question. Let me come at it a little bit. So probably your viewers understand from the video that Graphic Studio was founded in 1968. Therefore, we're celebrating our 50th anniversary. It was founded by Donald J. Saff. And at the time that Graphic Studio was established on the University of South Florida campus, there was a sense that there was a renaissance in American printmaking. And there were several studios, both commercial and some on university campuses, that were established over the next decade. Sarah Suzuki at the Museum of Modern Art has characterized this moment today and suggests that we're in a stealth renaissance for printmaking. And what she means by that is that the processes and the traditions of printmaking continue, with some major artists and most artists today very interested in working in prints, making prints, but also incorporating into their work, she puts it as insinuating into their work, the ideas and processes of printmaking. So Donald Saff, our founder, started out inviting really amazingly experimental artists like Robert Rauschenberg and James Rosenquist to come to the studio and to experiment with making fine art prints in limited editions. So that means by a limited edition, you make more than one, and each one replicates the other perfectly, and each one is signed by the artist. And we kept the editions very, very small. And Bob Rauschenberg, because he was an experimenter, because he was an innovator, broke a lot of the traditions of printmaking. He did things like stand up on the press and take strips of newsprint dipped in solvent and drop it on the press bed and run it through the press. So what happened was you repeated that, but each print was slightly different. And so he broke the whole kind of tradition of replicating editions perfectly. And we termed that editions variés. In other words, it was an edition, but there was a little bit of variation in each one. And over the years, a number of artists have incorporated handmade processes like hand coloring into the production of their work. Robert Mapplethorpe was one of those. He came to the studio to make photogravures. And photogravure is a very kind of alchemist magic process, but basically you're taking a photograph and you're turning it into an etching. And the mark that the etching marks that the etching process creates, or the tonal range, is very, very different than what would be in a silver photograph. And so we tried these photogravures with him, and he thought it would be really fun to make color photogravures. Almost impossible because of problems having to do with the registration. So his prints were hand colored. And so there's a unique aspect that's very much separate from the tradition of every print in an edition being exactly the same.
How interesting. And this process that you go through of experimentation, and we were talking earlier with Dr. Matthew Malarkey, the DBA program director at USF MUMA College of Business, that nominated Graphic Studio for this year's TBCN Impact Award. And he was saying how much he admires what happens at Graphic Studio and how important this process of experimentation, of bringing in the different perspectives. Oftentimes, I know you've said that these artists that arrive, maybe they aren't familiar with the printmaking process, and they're not printmakers, but they're working with your master printmakers and your artisans, and what evolves is something that's sometimes totally unexpected.
Well, the first point that you made, that this is an experimental studio, and artists are invited who may not actually print their own work. They work in collaboration with master printers and other artisans. And there's a series of experimentation that goes on for a week or two while they're in residence. And they do what's called proofing. And then out of the proofs, we try to get a BAT, bon à tirer, or approval to print. And then we make a decision about going forward with one print or another. So artists like Eva Gorgieva, who is a Bulgarian artist who moved here when she was about 17 and lives in Los Angeles, had never made a print. And so when she came into the studio, she was intrigued with the opportunities to make marks in a new way. And back to my first point about a stealth renaissance, she then took the scraps from all of her experiments at Graphic Studio and incorporated them into her paintings. So there's a kind of thinking process and a quality to the mark making that only comes through printmaking. And of course, she also produced monoprints, which are unique prints, and editions at Graphic Studio. So that's an example of an artist that had never made an etching, never made a lithograph, never worked in, never made a woodcut, relief print, and then experimented with all these different techniques and then incorporated them into her prints and her paintings.
And you mentioned, Eva, there's a number of other big name artists that you're either collaborating with right now or hoping to in the future. So I know that you're bringing in, is it Tavares Strachan?
Tavares Strachan was introduced to me by our new curator at large. And our curator at large is Christian Vivros Fonet, born in Santiago, Chile, very well known as an art writer. He also has a history of actually owning a gallery at one point, and as a curator, and he's actually curated shows internationally. So when I first went to New York with Christian, I was taken to Tavares Strachan's studio, and he is born in the Bahamas, and his work is so innovative and sensitive to marginalized peoples, figures that have not gotten recognition in, say, the encyclopedia. He talks about growing up in the Bahamas with the Britannica Encyclopedia as the way he discovered the world, and as he came and was educated in New York, or actually at the Rhode Island School of Design, I think is where he graduated from. His practice has recognized figures like Robert Henry Lawrence Jr., who was the first African-American astronaut, and he actually was killed in a jet plane crash before he was able to actually go into space. So Tavares has created a gold bust representing Robert Henry Lawrence, and it is going up in the SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket being shot up over from Qatar, and he's installing in schools, particularly schools and other small organizations, beacons, so that every time the satellite goes by, the beacon lights up.
How remarkable.
And he really is dedicated not to just making his art, but also of going into communities and as part of his art making, connecting with young people and introducing them to figures that they might not really have ever heard of. Like another one is Matthew Henson, who was part of an expedition to the North Pole, but you never hear about him. So he's done an encyclopedia, sort of an encyclopedia that gives visibility to the invisible. And he researched for 10 years, a decade, with a whole crew of assistants, an encyclopedia that he has produced.
How fascinating. Well, Margaret, we could actually have you back and back and back, and I hope that you will return to the show, but we're delighted that you could join us today. We look forward to learning more about the future artists that you're going to be working with and bringing to our area. And what's very important about USF Graphic Studio, clearly it's not just contained within the walls. As Margaret was saying, they participate in print fairs, but these artists are also experimenting with all new ways of communication and of leaving their marks, including out in the community. So thank you so very much for joining us, Margaret.
Thank
we
you
really
for
appreciate
inviting
it.
me, Susana.
That's Tampa Bay Community Network. I'm your guest host, Susana Weymouth.